All right, everybody, we are all the way live. Welcome to another episode of the Break the Rules stream, breaktherules.tv. I'm your host, Lev Polyakov at LevPo on Twitter. We got Paul Rossi. We got Styxhexenhammer666 back with us for a very early morning stream. Thank you guys so much for being here. We are simultaneously streaming, by the way, on Odyssey, on DLive, on Twitch. We are on all the networks. We are on all the MP3 networks, so you could find us on Apple, you could find us on Spotify. I'm going to be posting all the links, and of course, patreon.com/breaktherules. Here is a magnet that my father is working on right now. This is the Styxhexenhammer Dragon Ouroboros magnet. So look at him go. Look at him go. So this can be yours. I mean, this is still a work in progress. This is not finished yet, but this dragon can be yours for $20 patronage. So check out patreon.com/breaktherules. Check out our past catalog. We have a lot of great streams, and today is no different. So we are going to be talking about the education, not so much of the government schools, but we're going to get into that as well. We are going to be talking about the education of the elites, because I believe that there is an elite, that there is a hierarchy at any time in history, and it's important for the elites to set a particular example for the rest of the people to follow. And one of my biggest concerns back in 2015 has been the telltale signs that something is wrong. I mean, when it comes to the kind of content that a lot of these younger people are absorbing, I'm sure we could say that in the 60s things weren't great either, with Soviet influence and so forth, but today it seems to have been going in a very bad direction, and I think we're already seeing some of the people who are occupying positions of power as having been people who graduated, back when they were in college in 2015, and the kind of things that they're already doing. So I think it's already coming into play, and let's just start. So, Paul Rossi, can you tell us about your experience? You were a math teacher in Grace High School, and just tell us a little bit about your particular experience and what happened.
Sure, Lev. I've been teaching at Grace Church since about 2012 when the new high school opened. They had been a K through 8 school, and then opened a ninth grade, opened a high school in 2012. And I was a career changer, so I did not have a background in education until I got a master's in my 40s, and so I was a coder. I had different jobs before then, and over the it was enlightening to be in a classroom environment and teaching kids, because it really kind of reframed my previously fairly far left progressive beliefs, as I watched the school start to implement various programs and curriculum that they called anti-racist, in conjunction with a sort of blossoming, burgeoning DEI administrative level, and how that influenced the culture of the school, the children individually, their relations with each other, their sense of identity, and of course, like so many institutions around the country, corporate and educational, have reached ahead in 2020. Although I had seen a lot of things before that, with the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath of that. And this year in February, sort of the inciting incident to my story was that I spoke out at a segregated Zoom meeting. The Zoom meeting was segregated by race. And I questioned the ubiquitous white supremacy culture slide, which the facilitator put on the screen in front of 200 students and about 40 of my colleagues. And the aftermath of that was that I was made a scapegoat, and various administrative responses to my questioning of this slide and the teaching in general led to my ouster, and I won't be returning in the fall, which is upon us now.
And there was a recorded conversation of you with the principal where the principal admitted that this was indeed the situation that was going on. And later on, you started teaming up with other organizations like FAIR, like Parents Unite, Education Liberty Alliance. So we're always wondering, like, is there going to be a pushback to a lot of this stuff? And has the pushback started, and has it been in any way successful? People say that they're too far gone now, that the elites are too far gone. And before I get your answer, I'm curious, Styx, living in the sticks as you did before in Vermont, now living in Amsterdam, what are some of the things that you've been noticing as far as the changes that have been going on in education in general? And don't forget to subscribe, everybody.
Well, I can't say much about the Dutch educational system other than I imagine that it's not particularly woke. Despite the diversity in certain urban areas, it just doesn't seem to be a cultural thing. And I think that might be because the United States is still trying to grapple with that largely faux cultural issue of like the post-slave debate, Jim Crow and stuff like that. And so there are a lot of people that still have a lot of guilt because it's been promulgated on them, again, by rich people mainly to get into office. With critical race theory, it was definitely absent when I was in school. It wasn't a thing back in the day when I was a whippersnapper, and it should be absent now. I mean, as far as the pushback, though, it's been significant, even from abroad, looking at U.S. news and stuff like Corpus Christi. Their school board got completely overhauled almost instantaneously, and this has been the case in multiple states, multiple cities. There's a huge pushback against it, and a lot of it is being spearheaded by people who aren't white. Because you see, if you're non-white and you're not feeling that guilt, then you have less of a reason to not be completely skeptical of the claim. Critical race theory self-refutes multiple times. I just find it, I think that the most important thing to talk about with regards to critical race theory is the fact that it's grossly misrepresented by its proponents, while its proponents then strawman the people that are against it, claiming that they're misrepresenting it.
What would you say are some of the misrepresentations that you've seen?
Well, among the proponents of critical race theory, what happens is that they claim that it's about racial justice. But if you actually go through sort of line by line some of the people that are big names in critical race theory, you find that's not really the case. One of the main dictates of critical race theory writ large in the academic sense by some of its own academic proponents is undermining people like Martin Luther King, people who actually marched for some semblance of civil rights on the basis that they didn't accomplish enough. They're not, you shouldn't be peaceful. People shouldn't live in peace. They should be uncomfortable all the time. We get told white people are supposed to feel uncomfortable. And this by itself is not considered to be a racist statement. But under any understanding of yesteryear, certainly when I was in high school or something, if there was a political or a social movement that claimed people of a certain race should feel uncomfortable, they should feel uncomfortable because people that came before them, long before they were born, did something that was wrong, it would be rightfully classed as bigoted, and it would be understood that way, and people would just laugh at it and brush it off.
Now, when it comes to separating the people who go to, standard, high school, public school, with people who are supposed to be the ones that end up ruling things. If we are talking about Grace Church, I'm not necessarily saying that, Grace High School, I'm not necessarily saying that the people there are going to all be the rulers and the senators and so on and so forth, but there's still going to be people of measurable influence in comparison to everybody else. Do you know what the main difference, even before we get into CRT, is between the way that a lot of these kids are taught in these more higher-end institutions? Paul?
Well, certainly there's a huge gap between if you're just looking at the aggregate statistics on learning outcomes in public schools and some of these elite institutions. What I have noticed is a consequence, simply by some of the DEI efforts is a sort of move towards mediocrity, not for any reason other than simply, this, I think, Dick's touched on this sort of white guilt and this poverty of low expectations, where there's declining standards in those schools. So I don't know how long this is going to last, but certainly there is a sense of privilege, a real sort of noblesse oblige, an awareness of exactly what you're talking about in these institutions, that you will be expected to, take on positions of authority, and there's a kind of a general sense that this is the case, and it kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy, especially since, the money helps fulfill those prophecies. So yeah, there's definitely a real difference in culture, I would say, and it's felt very keenly, I should add, by students that are recruited from public schools that come into these environments. I mean, and some of the DEI efforts are, I think, a good faith in some ways, attempt to try to fix those cultural changes. It just gets pushed through a CRT filter in a really crippling way. So I would actually address those things slightly differently, those cultural differences within the private school environment. But
it is interesting, by the way, that Styx, and by the way, get this book, Debunking Critical Race Theory here. I am in major shill mode right now. So this is a great book. It's very short. It's like just 30 pages. And one of the things that you talked about, Styx, in this book is that there is a strange oxymoron happening here where people expect the government to be the one that's going to be in charge of implementing a lot of these changes. And the elites that we just talked about right now, Paul, those are going to be the same people who are going to remain in power. So why would they do things any different?
Yeah, exactly. There's also there are certain institutional monopolies that are present in the public school world as well. There's this group, the National Association of Independent Schools, which is the accrediting body or through their accreditors, they accredit the 1,600 super elite schools around the country. These are boarding schools, these are day schools, these are private schools for the elite, and so and a lot of the DEI training runs through this association, and there's nepotism. There are mentor protege relationships where they'll actually recruit from the student bodies of these schools at large tent revival conferences, and then those become feeders into those positions both within the schools, the DEI positions within the schools, and then also at the consultancies. So it is a kind of a giant blob of interconnected institutions that are essentially running like a kind of moral cartel, and it is a total expectation that everyone involved, from the administration on down to the teachers and the students, are all aligned with what are called the anti-racist goals of the association, which is just code for CRT essentially, or CRT praxis, I would say.
Was this going on in any way before we even got the term CRT? I mean, like Styx was saying, back when he was in college, it wasn't really emphasized, but at the same time, there may have still been, at least since the 60s onward, a little bit of that noblesse oblige, white man's burden, whatever the hell you want to call it, just this idea that there has to be some kind of an atonement happening. But it also, at least seems to me, that the image that I just posted over here on Twitter from Pano Parker, the most dystopian image of the year award goes to the new Amazon building in Mexico. So over here we can see a lot of these, shanty towns, a lot of these squalid places around this monolithic building over here. There seems to be like a lot of pollution, a lot of dirt, a lot of grime. This is the vision of you will live in the pod, you will eat the bugs, all that kind of thing related to the future that a lot of people online are very concerned about, because they see a lot of climate-related things, a lot of things related to the recent passport system that's implemented here in New York City. Again, YouTube algorithm. See, even with the YouTube algorithm, I can't really get into it without having a bit of a risk. But they see a lot more emphasis on control, with something like CRT in a way almost being used as an excuse to start implementing this kind of control. And they see any attempts to fight against it as being in vain, as something that, may exist between, let's say, yourself, Paul, Styx, myself, Bayan, as you know, from Fair, whose kids went to the Rudolf Steiner school, I believe, the Waldorf school. He got them out of there for the same reasons. And it seems like there aren't that many people that are, talking about changing it. The fear is that there's going to be enough people that are just going to sit back, sit on their hands, do nothing, not just with these recent passports, but any other kind of implementation from these people who start gaining power onwards. So, Styx, if you had some kind of a crystal ball, or if you can connect to your daimon for a second that you have conversations with, what kind of predictions would you be able to say are going to be happening in the future if we're not going to be strong enough to fight a lot of this stuff off? Like, let's not even talk about silver linings right now. Let's just get right down to the nitty-gritty, worst possible outcome.
Worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario is that critical race theory and things like it take hold in blue states, big city areas, and continue to drive a wedge between the average American and the urban elite. I think there's an easy way to solve this, which is just that the children of people who head companies that take public money or get public subsidies of any kind, or of politicians, should be forced into the public school system. Problem solved. And they shouldn't be allowed to have any form of tutoring beyond that. It should be a felony. If you do that, then if Bush's kids and Rockefeller's kids and Soros's kids or great grandkids at this point or whatever have to go through a public school system, they can't homeschool, they can't tutor, they can't go to a private school, maybe they would finally care about the educational system enough to get rid of some of the wokeness.
But to the point of Paul, because Paul was in a private school, things are not necessarily better over there. So how do we end up solving that problem of reforming the private schools?
Well, if it's a private school, ultimately, I would say it matters less, because the private school is a private entity. People are voluntarily signing up to go there, paying money usually in the process. They can have whatever zany things they want. It's the public schooling system that concerns me more, because it's taxpayer funded. And ultimately, if a person's not wealthy enough to have a private option or homeschooling, and then that takes time as well, not just money, then they have no choice but to use the public school system, which 90% of kids do. That desperately needs to be absent all the wokeness and nonsense. If a private school wants to be completely anti-woke and teach people that Mises is God and Ron Paul is Jesus Christ and stuff, that's great. People should be able to move to that area, send their kids to that school. If they want to teach that Chairman Mao is God, go ahead and do that. If people don't want to interact with that propaganda, then they won't pay the fee, the tuition, and their kids won't go there. I think as long as there's a homeschooling option and school choice and the public schools are solved for, I think the rest solves itself. Ultimately, if I had kids right now, I'd be looking into homeschooling, because I can't see any other option.
Well, like I said earlier before we started this, I was homeschooled from 5th grade onwards, went to acting school at the same time, and I do owe, I think, a lot to that as far as having more of a flexibility of mind than I may have otherwise had. Even I noticed, like, when going to college, there was a lot of pressure around me to conform to particular traditional ways that a lot of students went about things. But what concerns me still, though, is that, like Paul was talking about, the various problems within these private institutions, how much of a societal pressure is still going to be on a lot of parents, a lot of administrators to conform to this particular paradigm right now, despite any pushback. So, Paul, what do you think is going to be happening?
I'm sorry, you're thinking specifically in the private school realm, or
yes, specifically in the private school realm. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been on. I've had the good fortune, I guess, to join some of the trainings that I've seen recently by some of these DEI consultancies, and they are openly making calculations about how many parents they can lose. I mean, they're talking about, we could lose 20 parents, 20 families, if and we shouldn't treat any pushback as anything other than sort of a racist backlash, essentially. So these consultancies have such a sense of entitlement and control over the same institutions that hire them. It's very strange. So they openly talk about manipulating the board of trustees. They talk about they compare the parents to the rioters of January 6th, and how the same forces which are driving parents to simply ask questions about what's being taught to their children are the forces of the KKK. So they are completely, and that's sort of dictated by the theory, right? So everything is systemic, so you just double and triple down. But that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing such there's no compromise there. And so what I've dealt with enough of these private school administrations to know that their tactics are humor the parents up to the point where they become too much of a problem, and then cut them loose. And they're, for this particular, and I understand that sympathy for the devil is not forthcoming for a lot of these very wealthy parents, and you can see, and I do say that, like, you're going to have to make your own school if you don't like what's offered. But there really isn't alternatives to have the same cachet to get you into the top universities or whatever. So in this very sort of greenhouse world of the elites, when parents start to deviate from the cathedral values within those, they don't experience it as choice, because they would have to do some serious effort to create a new school, to homeschool, to get pods going, all this kind of stuff. And it's not entirely clear that the colleges in their kids' applications are going to accept that. They may even see it as a sign of deviance, right? Because all of these institutions are now vertically integrated to a degree where, you graduate from Grace, and then, the top schools know that you're, woke weaned, that you're pre-certified, with these values. But if you're homeschooled, well, we don't really know, exactly who's teaching you or what they're teaching you. We don't know. So there's a lot of anxiety around the strictures, ideological and sort of, I would say, status-based strictures, I would call them, around, with parents having to deal with considering other options, which ultimately I think that they have to do, because I have to disillusion a lot of parents who reach out to me and say, oh, well, the head of school has really listened to us, and I think he's a good guy. And I'm like, no, you're probably getting played.
Styx, thoughts?
I would think there is also another possible solution, which is to completely defund the public schooling system and privatize everything. Well, then if people aren't getting a return, then maybe they won't make an investment.
Do you think, Styx, that'd be like money following the child, like a voucher program, something like that?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not actually seriously commending the idea. I think that if we de-wokeify the public school system, that'll be all well and good, because we shouldn't be paying money to teach people lies anyway. Ultimately, I realize, though, what you're saying is true, which is the private school system is hooked up to like the Ivies and stuff like that more than public schools are. But that's going to be a thing regardless of the woke thing, unless it was hyper regulated by government, and then it would rip the private school system apart as well. So I think that's one of those situations where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it's better to just solve the base problem, which is the revision of history by Marxists, the lies that they're trying to peddle. Focus on that. Realize that the private school system is going to funnel people into the upper echelons of society. There's not a whole lot that can be done about that, with either deprivatizing it and thus ruining it, or at the same time trying to exert social pressure you're clearly not going to be able to exert without a massive cultural hegemon. which simply doesn't exist. But what does exist is a significant backlash against the wokeness in schools, though. It's huge. I mean, the legacy media wouldn't even be talking about it if it weren't, because they would rather shelve the story. They don't want to talk about some school board getting overrun by populists who then proceed to fire all the Marxists. The fact that they'll even talk about it, they'll put a spin on it and say, well, these evil right-wing extremists decide to kick out these very intellectual ivory tower dwellers, and now they've got a hillbilly educational system. The fact that they're even talking about it, though, shows their desperation and their fear, because otherwise their general thing would be, well, it's not a big thing. It's not a movement at all. Don't worry about it. Because otherwise, by simply talking about it, they implant into other people's minds all around the United States and the West that that's an actual movement. Well, that gives people some ideas.
By the way, I am going to request that if you guys have any questions for the later part of the show, send us your super chats, keep subscribing, so on and so forth. Now, to drop the school aspect of this for a while and just talk about the cultural aspect, assuming anything that we want to have implemented ends up, adorable cat, ends up not working out, we give it our best shot, it doesn't work, then what happens, culturally speaking, with the so-called leaders of tomorrow? Like, I'm imagining, for example, the Skull and Bones, if any of you guys saw that movie, The Good Shepherd, with Robert De Niro and Matt Damon. You know, they had them doing all sorts of blue activity within coffins and things that I doubt a lot of the racially aware youth is going to look at as being appropriate today. I can't imagine Skull and Bones working the way it was supposed to work back in the day. And part of me wonders, like, is there a succession of thought where you would have, like, a young George W. Bush sitting on the lap of George H.W. Bush, and George H.W. Bush telling him, all right, Sonny, when you become president, you're going to have to do A, B, and C. And again, I'm not saying that what he did was great, but I'm just giving an example of there being a certain patriarchal authority figure that's basically giving the gist of, okay, this is what you have to do to be the next in line to rule the world, basically. And it seems like, I don't know if the kids that are coming out today, if they're just pretending, like I'm talking about, like the elite ones, if they're just pretending to be into a lot of the CRT stuff, meanwhile they are just as Machiavellian, backstabbing, whatever you want to say, in private. So, Paul, when it comes to the students that were under your wing, did you see that they were true believers in a lot of this stuff, or did you notice that they were kind of, you know, like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I have to go along to get along sort of thing?
Oh, that's a great question. And some of it, I admit, you know, I have to, full disclosure, is opaque to me because I'm a teacher, and then students have their own ways of sub-communicating. And I, you know, I did have students that I could talk to that I felt would give me like the real deal of what was going on. And, you know, I even with me asking them to be very conservative in their estimates, I mean, they were saying that about, you know, 50% of the boys were faking it. But about, you know, only about 20% of the girls were faking it. So the gender gap is pronounced. You know, when I say faking it, I don't mean entirely just completely lying. I mean, you know, they may be liberal, but they may not believe in the excesses, and they're just going along and saying the stuff that they're expected to say. As far as things like Skull and Bones, you know, unless, you know, again, I'm just a teacher and I'm really not from that world outside of my work. So, but, you know, there may be still some vestiges of WASP, you know, culture behind the scenes where these things continue to exist, even though publicly, you know, you have this completely other ideology, which is like being presented to the world. But what I did notice is that the ambitious kids, you know, in every class, there's always like the Reese Witherspoon in election, right? You know, there's the go-getters, right? The ones that are going to be joining all the things and leading the clubs. And what I found was that the ambitious kids, and there always is there are always those kids are gravitated towards the woke stuff because that was the sort of discourse avenue for them to rise to the top of the status hierarchy, right? So the student council presidents and the kids that ran the affinity groups and all that, they were very, declaratively woke, in all of the things. And so they would decry the racism in the school, and they would say, and then we're going to issue a statement on, Asian hate. And it was a way of capturing, and of course that all goes on the applications, right? So that is it's like hanging a shingle for how plugged in you are to the values. So I think that no matter what, just like in the past, maybe anti-communism was sort of a way for that to manifest, and whatever discourse you have, the ambitious kids are going to gravitate towards it.
I wonder, though, when you said anti-communism, how much of that was in effect, because if we look at the 1930s, for example, there's a great book I recommend everybody look up called The Red Decade by Eugene Lyons, where it talked about how in the 1930s, not that far away from where Grace High School is, there were meetings at that, I don't remember the school right now, but there were all these intellectuals that were rabid Stalinists, like not just communists. They referred to, like the regular Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialists as social fascists, because they were not following the Stalinist line. So I think that things were pretty extreme back then, too, when it came to this fascination that people had with this alternative way of doing things, kind of like an, F you dad when it comes to the kind of culture that they grew up in here in the United States, which also makes me think like another argument that people bring up, that whole cycle of history thing, and I'm curious what you think, Styx. So if I were to don the robes of somebody who was a lot more neo-reactionary, who was a lot more trad, I would say strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men. Styx, where do you think we are currently in when it comes to that cycle, and do you accept that cycle or do you reject that cycle?
I think that in a microcosmic sense, it's definitely real, just like the cycle of government that Plato suggested. Of course, the republic that he suggests, he didn't understand that it just dumbs down each aspect of that cycle. I don't believe that we're truly quite in the hard times yet, though. I think that right now we just have a shitty president in the United States, and otherwise things will work themselves out. I think we're getting towards them, though. So hopefully we'll have plenty of strong people being created. I think ultimately, though, the wokeness, people are casting it off as though it's a unidirectional cultural hegemon or something like that. I see it as just fast fashion, which is that it's something that right now is being talked about, just like in the 80s, hardline feminism. Moral panics operate in the same manner. They inevitably die off because basically the reason why they're being adopted is it's exciting, it's different, it's something new and edgy, and it pisses your parents off or it pisses somebody else off, even if it's astroturfed by corporations and the leaders, so-called, of society. Young gullible people eat it up. It's corporatized, they buy the t-shirts, and then 3 or 4 years later, it's passé, and they move on to the next social issue.
When it comes to these waves, I agree. The one pushback that I would give, again, like, I personally don't think this is the way that it works, but for the sake of combative argument here, this is what we were talking about him earlier, Mencius Moldbug, a.k.a. Curtis Yarvin, talked about. So he has this quote, "Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he only swims left." So over here, within democratic societies, the Overton window of social norms will slowly but inexorably shift leftwards over time due to some deep underlying social force which Moldbug dubs Cthulhu. So despite the flailing of right and left, eventually a modern Western culture's norms always move left. So, Styx.
I would disagree on several levels. Firstly, I would say that left and right become meaningless in the larger sense. Secondly, that's not the historical reality that we see. The United States was never further left than it was 100 years ago. The peak of leftoidism, as we would generally conceive of it in the overarching sense, peaked in the 1910s through the 30s in the United States, culminating with FDR being elected, although his re-election was more World War II related than it was his social policies. Since then, we reverted massively in the other direction, and only lately have even come to the point where a sizable minority of the population even considers the bullshit of social democracy to be acceptable, let alone communism or outright socialism or something like that. The same is true in many other countries. Leftism, in some cases, was most burgeoning at the dawn of the 20th century, and in many cases reverted in the other direction. I mean, look at all the communist regimes that existed 60 or 70 years ago. There aren't many avowedly communist nations left. Most of them are irrelevant and dysfunctional, such as Venezuela or Cuba. Now, before you had the Soviet Union, now China, the only reason that they're even a major player is because they have a facade of outright capitalism in their economy in order to actually compete with other countries. So it's a little leftism. I would argue leftism is the past. It's basically a dinosaur in the age of flight, and it's actually leftism that's dying. That is the idea that states should have more power, that they have monarchs or oligarchies, theocracies, and stuff. That's sort of the same central planning aspect of old guard leftism, and that's being burned away over time as people are interacting more and more readily with each other. We need less government control, not more. So I think right now is a temporary stumbling block, temporary setback on the road to liberty, so to speak.
So we have a couple of comments over here based on what you were talking about, but even before those comments, one of the things that keeps being brought up, and I'm curious what both of you guys think, is that if we were to take, let's say, Ben Shapiro and teleport Ben Shapiro 50 years into the past, and then teleport whoever he meets up with, some commentator of that time, 50 years into the past as well, then each time you teleport them, they would meet somebody who would be more conservative, not less conservative than them. Wherein Styx, like you are absolutely right regarding the peak of communism, like I talked about before with the Red Decade, it was definitely around that era of the 30s. But as far as conservatism and the old adage, what has conservatism been able to conserve? I think that's where more of this pushback is coming from, where they don't really see people who, let's say in the past, would have been much more active when it comes to preserving culture, when it comes to not letting things go too chaotic as they see it. They see bits and pieces being given over, where the conservative of, let's say, 2050 would be advocating for things that the SJW advocates today, and their position would be seen as conservative relative to whatever may be coming next.
Well, I would argue that the left has also given up on many aspects of things. If you look at the leftoids, like the new wave left, which one of them is arguing for the state absorbing private property? At least outright. I know that elements of that, like a wealth tax and stupid things like that, that'll never happen, equate to that. But there aren't many of them that say, hey, yes, absolutely, I believe that if your own personal house is too big, that the state should tax you more or it's confiscated or something. It just doesn't happen. But if you went back to the 20s or the 30s, you'd find plenty of people with Soviet leanings and so forth, Maoist leanings later, that would actually express the same thing. I'd say it depends on what you consider traditional and where you would like to go back to in the past based on your conservatism. Because if you were to go back, let's say you go back to the nifty 50s or something. Okay, so people have the fedoras and smoke their cigarettes and drive their Cadillacs and shit. Well, I mean, they would have considered that aspect of life with the silver screen and Beatles records and stuff not long after. They would have considered that very, very new and hip and exciting and non-traditional compared to like the Victorian era. And they consider, you can read literature from all of these eras, and they always use terms like, we're progressive. I am editing a work right now from the 1880s, and it uses the term progressive to delineate people who understand that witchcraft doesn't actually cause disease. That was very hip, very novel at the time, because it wasn't, it was barely a century prior. People were getting burned at the stake as witches in many cases.
True. There was a comment earlier on here about how the communist regimes of a century ago, let's see, was this from, this was from Le Plerome. Yeah, but the communist regimes of a century ago were pretty much far right socially compared to the current establishment and left. LOL. Styx, thoughts, and also Paul, I would love to hear your opinions about this as well.
Well, it depends on which one. Of course, if you're talking about far right in the moral sense of traditionalism, you couldn't apply that to the Soviets. They overhauled and socially experimented with virtually every microscopic aspect of culture whenever possible, only tolerating the very existence of the Orthodox Church in some instances if they were to toe the line politically. Maoism certainly did the same thing, completely overhauled the manner of living for everyone in the entirety of China. Pol Pot probably the most of all. So
yeah, I mean, I think there's a distinction here. Like there's the tanky sense of leftism. There's the political sense of restructuring the state and culture, which I think Styx is right that's not, we're not seeing that anymore. But then what I see it more happening now is the idea of decadence, and in many ways, sort of the problem of prosperity has created a sort of a cultural leftism, of course, because of the machinations of the culture Marxist as well. Whereas, in the Soviet era, it was very left, but it was a masculine left. And I think there's a meme that's going around, which I found kind of interesting, which sort of shows a Soviet era soldier, and then a sort of a pink-haired he/she person in a shirt.
Social justice warrior.
Exactly, social justice. So where they're both considering themselves left, but to the Soviet soldier, this Western version is an abomination. So there is this. I think when you talk about weak men making hard times, I think this is more than a trend. I think we're kind of, maybe I'm more pessimistic, but I think we are in this state of, really decadence, especially with the amount of sort of money printing and the huge global debt problem. There's a reckoning coming. There's a really big reckoning coming. And I'm not sanguine about the prospects of the current hegemony that we're seeing. So I think there's going to be some major structural dislocations coming up when the wheels fall off.
So you're not a fan of the new romantic movement?
What is that? I would love to know.
If you want to see weak, effeminate men, my goodness, you got to look to the early 80s.
Oh, well, yeah. Oh, that's funny. I think actually, like, you mean like someone like Flock of Seagulls or
Duran
that kind of
Duran.
Thing? Yeah. But I actually see
very
that as
masculine music.
I think that they were still masculine. It's just that they were performing femininity in a way. It was there was
so
something.
are the male feminists, in all honesty. They're just trying to they're just trying to rape someone. So.
Well, we could even go further back to the Romantic period of the, the 1800s, if we're talking about, let's say, Mary Shelley's husband, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron. Percy Shelley was very, asexual, you could say, and there may have been, Styx, I don't know if this is something within your wheelhouse, possibly, because Percy, as far as I understand, was very interested in alchemy, very interested in transmutation, where you could say he even looked like this androgynous idea of an Adamic man.
So it's like David Bowie if David Bowie never had access to a guitar, basically.
Exactly, yes. And Jason Giorgiani thinks that it was actually Percy Shelley who wrote Frankenstein, but wanted to attribute it to Mary. And he says this because from what I understand, Percy Shelley was the one who was mainly fascinated with a lot of these things that were brought up in Frankenstein as opposed to Mary. But that's a whole other discussion. I just wanted
to throw... It's gender appropriation. You're trying to take her empowerment away. Pure sexism.
Yeah, maybe that's what he wanted to do back in the day to kind of try and even things out, because I imagine there was a lot more sexism back then than today. But anyway, going back to the subject at hand, this is something that people can... Goodbye horses. Yeah, thank you. Now I remember that scene from Silence of the Lambs. So going back to our original topic here. the masculinity that people see within, let's say, more tanky-oriented Soviet systems, you could say that that played a role in Russia. But let's say if we're talking about like the early 20s in Russia, especially during the period of the new economic policy, there was a bit of Weimar within the USSR. Not as much as Weimar Republic, but if we're talking about, let's say, rampant orgies and people just having, a lot of free sex. I mean, from what I understand, Lenin got a venereal disease. I think he got syphilis. So everybody...
You got it from fucking Karl Marx.
Well, I didn't know he was a necrophiliac. That's a new one for me. But either way, these people had a lot of fun after the Civil War in Russia, which makes sense. Like after any big conflict, like the Roaring '20s, you would always have a bit of a satisfaction. But afterwards, let's say when Stalin came in, and by no means am I advocating for the things that Stalin did, I think he definitely gets one of the top high scores right next to Chairman Mao as far as the amount of atrocities perpetuated by a single individual. But when it comes to what people seek out, when they even look like somebody, when they look at somebody like Joseph Stalin, those posters of him with the medals and all this toughness, like they look at that and then they look at the people today, and what they're afraid of the most, I think, inside is, if we take this definition of freedom not just to mean freedom from authoritarianism, totalitarianism, but freedom from one's own desires overtaking oneself and creating just a chaotic, disorganized mess as opposed to something orderly, where they would say, you know what, yes, Stalin, he killed a lot of people, but so did Mao, but at the same time, at least they were trying to establish some kind of order, while today there is no order. Like, look at that garden that they were trying to build in Chaz, complete disorder, nothing grew. Yes, they may have chopped some blades of grass down in order to maintain a certain order, but at least that's what they were focused on. Now there is no order. Like, what would you respond to that?
Who?
You.
Oh, I would say yes, but it's always false order and it always falls apart. It's just like Chairman Mao trying to establish order, but then saying, well, I've got a bright philosophical idea straight out of Confucius. So the sparrows eat some bits of corn from the farmers, so we're going to kill all the sparrows. And then you have a locust swarm. Well, if that's the nature of order, then no wonder I'm a libertarian.
But in order for us to go back to, well, I wouldn't say, I mean, people always accuse me of wanting to go back to the early 90s, not as opposed. I know you want to go back to the 80s. Like, what would you say is your decade 6?
I want to go back to the 80s if it's music and style and like neon lights and cool cars and stuff. That sounds great. Imagine the 80s, but with really strong Wi-Fi. That sounds good to me. Let's stick ourselves in 1983 or thereabouts, and then just forget this progress nonsense.
Paul, what about you? Which decade?
I got to go with the 70s. I kind of like the muscle cars from that era, and
well, we do have Jimmy Carter
Dodge
as
Darts.
president.
Yeah, well, he can have a malaise. I think that what's the saying? Speaking of Confucius, was it him or maybe it's the Tao, where they say, when the leaders are weak, the people are strong, something like that.
That's the
I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
I wish that was the case. I'm not sure there are that many strong people today. And again, I am really trying to, since we don't have somebody on here who would be, let's say, more of a reactionary, I'm trying to play reactionary over here by saying that since we don't have that many strong people, the only thing that we have to look forward to change things around would be there being some strong man to come in and set things right. And in a way, Styx, would you say that is what attracted people originally to Donald Trump, where they saw in Trump somebody who would be like a model of a Mussolini type strongman, even though, again, like, he's not Orange Hitler or anything like that, but, the idea that people had, there was something that they almost, you could say, feel within themselves, like if only we had somebody to come in here and cleanse the palate.
It's more like they're like, well, if only I had that capability. but they don't want to actually take the initiative to be like that. They want someone else to do it for them. And you'll notice that it was a false hope. Donald Trump did a very good job in his role as president, in my opinion, but he was stymied time and time again on multiple things. The people that didn't want to take initiative never gave him a Congress that would work with him. And so the effect was ultimately blunted. And also, I had warned people during the primaries, if Trump is elected, not to expect him to be the God Emperor. He's going to do a good job, but he's not going to be able to achieve everything that he's telling you he wants to achieve because he'll be blockaded. And this ended up turning out true. Short of having a dictatorial overthrow, like an actual insurrection or something, you've got to work within the system that's there, and it takes incremental reform, but people don't have the patience in many cases to actually see it through.
Paul, what do you think?
I do. I agree with Styx on that one. I think whenever you look for a savior, it's because you lack something within yourself, or you lack the community around you to create something, a sense of order with your own people. So like one of the things I'm encouraged by with these sort of local school board revolts is that I think that's sort of the Tea Party had the promise of this, but it got sort of captured and co-opted by GOP standard politicians. But the idea that you can create your own local networks, create your own, schools, homeschool, pods, anything that is a sort of a rebirth of local community organizations. Like I think that there's a book, I think it might have been The Big Sort, I'm not sure, but where they talk about how these organizations like Kiwanis and Lions Club, these networks of people that would even have health insurance networks, these things were organic to communities.
Freemasons?
Well, I don't know about them, but
no, they do a lot of charity work apparently.
Well, to the extent, yeah, if it's good, it's good. So that kind of thing is going to what ultimately I think our salvation lies in those in rebuilding networks outside of the traditional forms, the pub, even the government stuff. So I have hope for that.
I want to be as realistic as possible here, where I agree with both you, Paul, and Styx when it comes to grassroots movement being something that can potentially change a lot of things. Same thing with the internet, having more decentralized models out there. Like we're on Minds as well, by the way. Break the Rules is on Minds.com. Big fan of Minds. But when it comes to being realistic and saying we're going to give it our best shot, it may not work. The people may be too far gone, either because they're too lazy, too demoralized, most people really just don't give a crap. Then what exactly will it take to change things? If it's not going to be us having these movements, these small movements that grow over time, if it's not going to be enough that parents are going into the school boards right now and trying to change things, if there is going to be this dystopian technocracy that ends up treating the United States like China's treating its own citizens with the social credit score. We're already seeing examples of this in Australia, by the way. Styx, you've seen that piece of news, right? Like where people's social media accounts are going to be now linked to whatever it is that they do as far as, getting a certain score based on what they say online. So if it's already part of the Western world, and by all accounts, Australia should be considered part of the Western world, the question there is, what exactly do people have, and how long would it take for there to be some kind of a change there? Or is this something that can actually doom people to such an extent that there will be this dividing line between the elites who live in Elysium and all the little people, all the Morlocks who are going to be stuck inside of this cybernetic, slavish mindset? Because that's something that Nietzsche talked about. Nietzsche's prediction was that there's going to be the Übermensch, and there's going to be the people that are going to be mixed with robotic, robotic tendencies, you could say, in the mind, as well as certain augmentations, but eventually the worker human bots are going to become just pure robots, and we are going to have the Georgia Guidestones coming to life, as far as it's going to be like the elites and it's going to be the robots, and that's it. Like that's the other scenario here. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I would say that'd be definitely an interesting future. I don't think it's technologically attainable.
Can you elaborate?
Oh, well, I'm creating like cyborg humans that slowly degenerate into robots. I think that's definitely a sign of the times in Nietzsche's mind.
I think
So
it's
ultimately, I think I'm more optimistic possibly than both of you, because I think that the local pushback is growing, and even the pushing by governments to do the coronatarian thing or the CRT thing, the woke thing. In some cases, by the way, I apologize, the ambulance and whatever going by. Yeah, it's banshee sounds. Someone's dying. They probably got the coof. I think that the backlash is growing actually, and that there's a new sort of cultural paradigm that's slowly arising, and it's not in favor of or in direction of leftoidism, not as we would generally understand, and it's certainly not in favor of authoritarianism. I think it begins in the United States, at least with the Ron Paul revolution many years ago. I think since then, I think that is the origin of the backlash against what we could consider the initial rudiments of like postmodern leftism. I think it sort of begins there.
Well, there is one more thing I would add to push back a little bit on this, where I wouldn't take the roboticization of the human being literally as far as people being augmented, even though that may be a possibility down the line. Let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's look at it from what already I think is going on now. We have the internet. We have the ability to gain any piece of information we want. You know, we can go to LibGen and just get tons of books on whatever we want, while at the same time, most people don't do that. Most people just end up being tuned into this feedback loop of whatever very, let's say, low quality information it's very attractive for them to engage with. Yeah, exactly. And so my thing here is that if people are going to be stuck in this loop, aren't they already kind of becoming robots then? When that's like, if they're mentally robots, what's the difference? Like, we still have something that we may not have had in the past. Like, you could say in the past, people were stuck in the paradigm of, only knowing what they know regarding gardening, regarding tilling the soil. But at the same time, their minds may have been working a lot more actively because they were focused on, okay, when is it going to rain? I have to water my crops, yada, yada, yada. Like, there may have been more things that were occupying their minds, which kind of grounded them to a certain kind of reality, as opposed to right now, where it's just like this weird virtual blob like you could even see it in the artwork that comes out. You could even see it in do you both of you guys know Flat Design?
No.
So there was an account back in the day called Humans Flat, and it had various examples of, I think I showed it to you, Styx, before, where people are being depicted as just like these blob-like creatures with small heads, and like a lack of feature, lack of personality. Like, here's one example. I just found it right now as as an example here you'll see in the chat. So something like this.
Yeah.
So the idea being is that all personality is just being evacuated out of human consciousness, and we're just going to have these drone people. So if that is the case, what do you think is the cure to that, and is there even a cure to that? This is basically like my pushback again on saying people may be roboticized, but in a different way, not in the physical way.
A nuclear war would work.
Yeah, no, I think it's a compelling analogy for what's already happening. I mean, you have income inequality growing, you have inflated currency, people's savings are being inflated away, asset prices are going up, there's this divergence, and it's conditions of anxiety, and under conditions of anxiety, I think people react by taking on sort of repetitive behaviors, compulsively repetitive behaviors, needing to be in the cell. I need to hear what makes me feel safe. I need to look for the thing that I recognize. I need to confirm that there's order, at least in my own thinking, because the world is chaotic and can't be trusted. And then, this is also scary because, it can lead to authoritarian saviors looking for, great princes to come and rescue us. And but I think it's a function more of the pervasive anxiety. If you have a more, traditional rhythmic cycles that you are more or less reliable, then you can actually sort of relax and a little bit because you know what you have to do. And then it can sort of create perhaps more curiosity. I don't know. That's the way I think of it. I think that some of the science bears it out.
I would like to, before going to Super Chats, and by the way, Styx, it is 8 a.m. right now. How are you doing on time?
How are you doing? I got to disconnect pretty soon here. So if we get to any Super Chats or anything questions, that'd be good.
Excellent. Okay, so before we get to Super Chats, though, I have one final question for you, Styx, having to do with where do you see the occult playing a role in this, if any? Do you think that with the advent of the internet, with the advent of people having all this information at their fingertips, there may come an interesting thing where a few people can start utilizing certain, let's say, more esoteric knowledge, for lack of a better word, and be able to command it and pull off a Napoleon or pull off a, you name this person. Like, I'm not necessarily sure, like, what Trump did, but do you think that there's going to be a similar phenomenon happening among smaller groups who just have way more knowledge?
Yeah, so it's already happening. Independent creators are still kicking the ass of legacy media and legacy political networks, despite all odds being against them, despite having virtually every moneyed billionaire, virtually every military power and state in the world gunning for them, are still winning. I would say that that's already happening, although I don't know that it's specifically a cult in most ways. The spread of information and the willingness of people to find it, it certainly it separates the wheat from the chaff. That's what I would say.
Definitely. And Paul, any thoughts on that at all? I have no idea if you are into the occult or not, but you are in mathematics, and mathematics, I think, especially with something like Kabbalah, has always been, going hand in hand with the occult.
I think there is a kind of intuition, a kind of some sort of divine intuition. I'm really not familiar with the occult, but I think that there are ways that the mind makes sense of things where it's not a logical process. It's more of a divination, and I think that people definitely need. It's important for me to be in touch with that. It's important for everyone who's a soulful human being to be in touch with that.
Excellent. On to Super Chats. And everybody, please be sure to subscribe, and keep subscribing, share, and add a like. I never say to add a like, so I'm saying it right now. Keep adding those likes. Anyway, first Super Chat, Jacob Wells, $5. For Tarl, I teach collegiate English and raise my little brother. This other guy's credibility is shot. Raise your own family, not someone else's. So I asked Jacob Wells if he can elaborate on what exactly he means by this, because from what I understand, like Paul, you have great credibility. I'm not sure what this guy's getting at, but any thoughts?
He might be just comparing homeschool to private school. Like some people see private school as maybe the public alternative, and I guess maybe he's encouraging people just to homeschool. I'm not 100% sure.
Maybe. I have no idea. But either way, next Super Chat, we have Joe Undead Cookie Monster, $4.99. Thoughts on the fourth turning?
None.
That's Is that Steve Bannon's thing? Is that
no fourth turning? It's actually a pretty old book. I think it was written let's see, back in the 70s. Let's see, it's over the Strauss-Howe generational theory. According to it describes
I'm aware of Strauss-Howe. I wasn't aware of the title of the book.
Yeah, so what do you think?
So the idea is we're going through the fourth generational cycle in the United States. Yeah, it does line up pretty well. I guess you get these 4 generations, and the idea is that each one has different characteristics, and it's about like 20-ish years per generation. And so it's cycling around to the 4th generational sort of cycle, I suppose.
Is that like the Kali Yuga
No, this is more sociological in nature. It's just the different, like one generation affects the next, and so it tends to follow roughly a 4-stage cycle, roughly every 80-ish years.
Okay. and it kind of circles back on itself, kind of a
it
viral thing.
replicates over and over again. Although I don't think there's any exact date and timing for each generation. There's some wiggle room involved, I guess.
Interesting. Greg Marat, $7.99. As symptom, entrepreneurs, artists, and high-achieving students cluster around trade openness. Could this explain the manifestation of CRT edifice?
I have no clue what they're referring to.
It's trait. Is it trait openness or trade openness?
Trait. Trait.
I think maybe initially in the postmodern phase, but what's happened now is it's become the opposite of openness. It's become a sort of a ritualistic set of beliefs, and people are reading off the same script. I think in the academic circles, where you're even then, actually, I think it's devolved into the opposite of openness. But I think in the 80s and 90s, I think there was definitely a lot of trade openness, people gravitating towards it. It's hard to say, but yeah, that's my sense.
Excellent. And finally, we have Finn Castle Underground 2, $20. Thank you so much, Finn Castle. In my town in rural Vermont, maybe a neighbor of yours, Styx, there are normally 3 kindergarten classes per year. Now we only have 1. People are homeschooling and disentangling from the system. The strong are quietly operating underground. So
first I think he said Virginia, not Vermont, actually, VA.
Oh, VA.
A little distance away from there. I would say definitely people will take up the slack when they need to. And so there is sort of a quasi meritocracy that goes on, which is in families where there's at least some degree of intellectual capability to do so, they'll pick up the slack for the nonsense in a public school usually. So.
And that is my hope, too. Like, regarding the past conversation where I was trying to go for a more neo-reactionary stance here, what I think ends up falling apart for me when it comes to the conclusion of a lot of these stances is that if there is going to be some kind of a leader who comes in, then they eventually are going to get corrupted by time, if not corrupted from the very beginning, and it's only going to create a more, a situation that people rarely are able to disentangle themselves from. People complain about CRT today. Try disentangling yourself from the kind of state where people are getting locked up for criticizing the leader. That is not something that any of the people who advocate for it would actually want to be in it. Again, I think a lot of them think that they're going to be the ones who are going to be in the inner party. They're going to be the ones who are calling the shots. Rarely, in my experience, would that actually happen that way. But I think there is a certain kind of fire in the belly energy that people see within certain leaders that they may want for themselves, or they may want to at least be represented in the open, so that energy could spread across to other people. And I think that people are seeing a very low energy society today in the various classes that we have. So with that, any final thoughts on anything you guys want to touch on before we go?
Remember that critical race theory is a total failure. That's all I would remind people of. Always run for local office, look into local civics, and try to do it yourself, because the government won't do it for you.
Excellent. Paul?
I would say I agree with that, and I would also say if you're a student at a public or private school, remember that you have the sovereign right to define your own individuality as you see fit. Do not let anyone else tell you who you are, what you have to ascribe to, no matter how emotionally manipulative they are. Maintain your cognitive liberty.
Excellent. And with that, final plugs. Twitter.com/Paul D. Rossi, Rossi. guys, please follow Paul on Twitter. Please support Paul. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming in and talking about all this stuff with us. Of course, if you guys are not following Styx on Twitter, I don't know what you're doing. One of the best shit posters on Twitter, bar none. So, guys, please follow Styx on Twitter, although you probably already are. And, of course, subscribe to Styx's YouTube channel. It would be very strange if there was somebody here who was not already subscribed to Styx's YouTube channel. But I'm sure that there are some of you guys out there, some of you people who are not subscribed to Break the Rules. What are you doing? You're watching the stream and you're not subscribed to us. What? What's going on? This is no good. Subscribe to Break the Rules right now. You can go to breaktherules.tv if you're listening to the audio version of this, if you're listening on DLive, if you're listening on Twitch, and of course, patreon.com. Wait, before patreon.com, check this out. This is Styx's Debunking Critical Race Theory book 2021. Get this book. I'm adding the Amazon link into the chat right now. It is a great read. I would suggest you buy it in bulk and then just leave it around college campuses. That should be that should be the strategy. And of course, follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/LevPo, LEVPO. And lastly but not leastly, let me just grab this. All right, this is the prototype of the Styxhexenhammer magnet over here. See, we have the dragon over here, the dragon Ouroboros. Now, this is just one layer over here. This is going to be a carved out multi-layer magnet, refrigerator magnet. This can be yours if you go to patreon.com/breaktherules, become a $20 patron, and mention that Styx sent you, or you got here from the Styx stream. And we need your help to grow. BTR needs your help to grow. We are a small channel, but it's been growing since since May of 2020 from 300 subscribers. We are now at 6,000 and I don't know how many subscribers. But the point is that we are small. The algorithms are going to be against us. So it is up for us to unite, to grow, and to keep having these conversations that are going to uplift us to another level. So once again, Styx, thank you so much for coming in. Paul, thank you so much for coming in. Patreon.com/breaktherules. Go there or be square. And we are also going to have Adam Krigler on, who you guys probably know from Tim Pool's show. Adam Krigler is going to be joining us this Thursday. Here is the link to the Adam Krigler episode. Be sure to subscribe. You're going to see it after the stream is over as well, so be sure to do a reminder thing there, click the bell, all that good stuff. We're going to have a lot of great episodes coming on. Styx is going to be back October versus Joel Davis, who is much more authoritarian. I am not going to be able to be and thankfully I'm not going to have to be as authoritarian for that stream. I'm just going to sit back and eat some popcorn and stuff. So anyway, guys, this is the end of the stream. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe. Thank you guys so much. Mwah! Good night, everybody.